What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rantin Review Pro Wrestling. It is that time of the year. Well, it's that time of the year this year. It hasn't been this time of the year for a couple of years. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about. It is a G1 Climax 32, which is now back in its usual time slot in the year during the summer months. Here in 2022, the last 2 years, pandemic and Olympics and all kinds of stuff has preempted it. But we are back with the G1 in New Japan Pro Wrestling. It is going to be, again, another 4-week tournament. It is the most grueling and probably the most well-respected tournament in all of modern wrestling. And we're going to get into it today, get into the changes for this year, get into the participants and who I think might win, who I think might lose. And before we get into that, though, I do want to start talking to you guys, especially if you're new to New Japan and new to the G1, as to what the G1 Climax is and why it's so important. Now, I'm sure if you're a wrestling fan who's from AEW or WWE or Impact or anywhere else and you've never seen a G1 before, you may think, oh, it's just another tournament. Like, you know, AEW just had the Owen Hart tournament or the old King of the Ring tournaments in WWE or some of the various tournaments they've had in Impact. But the G1 is slightly different. The G1 is a round robin tournament, which lends itself to be, for American audiences and for, I guess, Western audiences in general, more like a season of a sports team, if you think about it that way. Like if you think about it like a season of the NFL and then you have the playoffs or the Final Four or Wimbledon or the Major League Baseball playoffs or anything like that. It is essentially the best form in pro wrestling of what I would call playoff pro wrestling. So you get all of that excitement. And if you are an actual sports fan and you do like the Final Four and March Madness and the NFL playoffs and stuff like that, and you like wrestling, this is Christmas for you because that is the excitement that you get in the G1. You get the playoff atmosphere in a wrestling context, which is where, as many of us have said about companies like New Japan, they tend to focus a little bit more on the sports aspect of it. So you get the excitement of an actual sport, but it's predetermined so they can determine the drama that you would get in sporting events and have it make sense. It's kind of the purest essence of what pro wrestling actually is supposed to be. So in the past, the G1 has operated on several nights throughout 2 different blocks, an A block and B block. Now, in 2022, for this year's tournament, they have changed it up for several reasons. It is now 4 blocks of 7. So these 4 blocks will not be competing as in the past. You'd have the A block matches all on one night. So it'd be 5 A block matches. And then the next night you'd have 5 B block matches, and they kind of alternate between the 2 blocks throughout the 4 weeks of the tournament. This year, they're kind of having 1 or 2 matches from each block on every single night, which I think there are, like I said, there are a number of reasons for this. One of which is now not having a 10-man block or 8-man blocks means you're wrestling a lot less matches throughout the tournament. So as opposed to like prior years where you had 10-man blocks, that means you were wrestling 9 matches over a 4-week period and 9 somewhat main event or at least semi-main event level matches that you were expected to perform. Whereas this year, you're really wrestling 6 matches against other guys in your block. I mean, honestly, you think about it back in the day, like instead of, if you were one of the wrestlers in the G1 and you're like, man, this is a slog, 9 main event level matches over 4 weeks. And then you're just hoping when you look at the chart for that week and you look at the schedule for that week that Yano's in your match, you're like, at least I get a break with him. But this year, again, a little bit different. 7 guys in each block, totaling up for 28 men, which is one of the largest blocks, one of the largest G1 fields that they've had in quite some time. Now, some people have complained about it, of course, because people complain about everything because this is pro wrestling. There are complaints that people expected more AEW guys to be in it, and some people didn't want certain guys that they didn't feel should have been in the tournament last year to be in a tournament again this year. I'm looking at you, Chase Owens, and Yujiro Takahashi. But I think overall, I think the way they divvied them up, and we'll go through the 4 different blocks and the 4 different personalities of those blocks in this video, I think it's a good field. I don't think it's the best G1 lineup we've ever seen. I think the late 20s, G1 26, 27, 28, 29, I think those were some of the best G1 lineups that we ever had. But I understand, again, in this year where you got a lot of injuries, where you're asking guys to come in from overseas, you're trying to make this not as grueling as it has been in the past. So we'll see how this all works out. The one thing I do note, though, is that, in the past, if you've been following my channel, I usually keep up with the G1 like it's a sporting event, and I have standings and everything else. This year is going to be different because the blocks are all... It's not like you get all the results from one block in a night and then you can see the standings. It's going to be an evolving thing over time to keep track of all 4 blocks and who's in the lead and who's not. So we are going to be doing that again this year on the Rantin Review YouTube channel here for the Pro Wrestling channel. So you guys will be able to follow up with the G1. I'll be doing almost every other night or every 3 nights an update as to where the G1 is, what the standings are, and what matches to look forward to coming up. It's been quite a few years. I think it's been over 10 years since they've had the semifinal and then the final standings for the G1 Climax. They've done this before in the past with the tournament, but it's been quite some time. That was done pre-New Japan World era, where we can all now watch the G1s live on New Japan World. So I definitely suggest getting New Japan World. If there's any time to get New Japan World, it's this time. It's for the $9 for the next 2 months. You might as well sign up for it and then see some of the greatest wrestling matches. And again, if you're a sports fan and you like wrestling, this is Christmas for you. You definitely want to watch the G1. There's no better example than the first ever G1 that they had on New Japan World that we could actually watch all the nights live. And that was back in the G1 that Kenny Omega won, the first Gaijin, non-Asian Gaijin to win the G1. That year, Kazuchika Okada and Hiroshi Tanahashi were in the A block, and they were going into the finals on the last night. Whoever won that match was most likely going to win the block. However, Hiroki Goto earlier in the night won his match, which actually gave him a tiebreaker win over Okada and Tanahashi, but it was a long shot. The only way Hiroki Goto could win the block is if Tanahashi and Okada went to a draw. Now, at this period of time, Tanahashi and Okada were still neck deep in their storied rivalry during the mid-2010s, and most people thought one of them was going to win the match. Tanahashi goes up to the top rope to hit the high fly flow at the last second, hits it, Red Shoes counts, 1, 2, the bell rings right before his hand goes down, the time limit goes out, everybody's gasping, and it's like, oh my God, what? Wait, that means Goto won the block in the last minute. It's dramatic shit like that. And they've had tons of those things happen in the G1 over the last several years. It's stuff like that, again, which is why the G1 is fantastic. Okay, so the rules for the G1. Again, like I said before, you're wrestling every other guy in your block. So think of it like a division in like the NFL, the MLB. You play everybody in your division. In the blocks, you fight everybody in your blocks. So you wrestle all the other guys in your block, and within that block, whoever has the best record and the most points will go on to the finals. Matches are 30-minute time limit matches, so you have to beat somebody within the 30-minute time limit. Now, the points are dispersed like this. If you win the match, no matter how you win the match, you get 2 points. If there is a draw, you get 1 point apiece, you and your opponent. And if you lose the match, you get a goose egg, no points. Now, as far as the standings are concerned, tiebreakers do come into play, especially going into the last week and the last night of the G1 Climax tournament. So you can have situations, like I mentioned before, the one with Tanahashi, Goto, and Okada from several years ago, where you got to wait to the last minute, and it might not be the 2 guys you think are going to win. If one of them loses or is a time limit draw or something like that, there's a lot of drama tied up with those standings in this tournament. There's also the potential for spoilers. Spoilers are very big in this tournament. And last year, they kind of went a little overboard with the spoilers in the tournament. But traditionally, guys like Toru Yano in particular, who you don't expect to win the G1, but Yano has been deadly dangerous in this tournament for screwing up guys and beating guys like Kota Ibushi, or giving losses to Kenny Omega or somebody like that, or even Jon Moxley, who lost his first New Japan match against Toru Yano because of Yano's shenanigans and screwed up Moxley's chances of winning the G1 the year Moxley was in it. It's guys like that, and on the other side, guys like Bad Luck Fale, who might not ever win a G1, but he's going to rack up about 4 or 5 wins and get about to 8 or 10 points in the tournament. and you don't want to run into Fale in this tournament either. So let's look at this year's blocks and see where everything shakes out, and I'll give my summary at the end after we look at the blocks and who I think is going to wind up winning A block, B block, C block, and D block, and potentially the entire tournament. The A block, also known as the Monster Block this year. Among the Giants here are Lance Archer, Bad Luck Fale, Jeff Cobb, and Jonah. Tom Lawler's no slouch himself, and he's perhaps one of the toughest wrestlers in the business right now. And of course, you have the gold standard Kazuchika Okada, who has an interesting challenge for him this year. This year, they have put him in with a bunch of big, brutal guys where, don't expect a lot of 5-star matches coming out of Okada. Okada might be fighting for his life this year with these monsters he's fighting against. And then, of course, there's Toru Yano, who is always a wild card, but again, he's going to have a rough time pulling his shenanigans against all of these bruisers that he's going to be facing. And of course, the match with Okada should be comedy gold, as it usually is. Key matches for the A block will be Okada versus Lawler, Cobb versus Jonah, Archer versus Fale, and a rematch from the two undefeated guys from last year's G1 Climax, Kazuchika Okada and Jeff Cobb. The B block. Treacherous would be the best way to describe the block, headlined by current IWGP World Heavyweight Champion Jay White. You also have notorious rule breakers in here like Taichi, Chase Owens, as well as the history of Tama Tonga, Sonata, and a Great-O-Khan, who themselves are not choir girls and have been known to break quite a number of rules themselves in the past. Add in Bruiser Tomohiro Ishii, who seems like he traded places with Yano, and Ishii was supposed to be in the A block with the rest of the Bruisers, and Yano was supposed to be in here with the Shenanigans guys. But despite that, Ishii kind of being thrown in the mix with all of these rule breakers should be interesting. Key matches for the B block will be Chase Owens versus Jay White in a battle of Bullet Club, Sonata and Taichi, who always have interesting matches, the Great-O-Khan hopefully stepping it up against Tomohiro Ishii, and of course the showdown between Tama Tonga and Jay White, which will finally happen from this whole blow off from the last several months of Tama getting kicked out of Bullet Club by Jay White. They will finally face each other one-on-one during the G1 tournament. The C block is what I would call the block with the most even competition. It might also have some of the best matches of the whole tournament. Highlighted by having two main event talents in Hiroshi Tanahashi and Tetsuya Naito, this block also features Zack Sabre Jr., who is a tournament killer to always watch out for, Kenta, Hiroki Goto, and Evil, all men who have either won or been damn near close to winning a G1 in recent years. Aaron Henare is making his first G1 appearance this year, and while it might be likely that he'll be picking up many of the L's and might be sitting at a goose egg for most of this tournament, don't be surprised if he does get a big win here or there over some of the top guys during this 4-week stretch. Key matches will be Naito versus Tanahashi, obviously, Kenta versus Naito, Evil versus Goto, Tanahashi versus Henare. And the reason I'm circling that is that Tanahashi has a really bad tendency to lose the first match of the G1, especially if it's against a guy who's an undercard guy, kind of an underdog. So keep an eye out on that Henare match. Do not be surprised if Henare beats Tanahashi on the first night. And Zack Sabre Jr. basically against anybody who's a main event talent, because this block looks like it's designed for ZSJ to possibly run away with. And then the D block, perhaps the strangest block in this year's field. The D block is highlighted by the Commonwealth Kingpin, Will Ospreay, and a bunch of men who have something of a grudge against them. Whether it's Juice Robinson and the ongoing issues for the United States Championship, his buttering modern classic of a rivalry with Shingo Takagi, or the threat of a possible future replacement for him as the Gaijin performance ace in El Phantasmo, Ospreay will have his work cut out for him to keep pace with Shingo, as I expect both of them to lead the blocks neck and neck for most of the tournament. However, do not sleep on perennial underdogs David Finlay, who's making his G1 debut, Yujiro Takahashi, and Yoshihashi, all men who want to rise to the occasion. Finlay in particular possibly having a breakout year, but also keep in mind there's always a chance that Yoshihashi might overperform. Key matches are Phantasmo versus Ospreay, Ospreay versus Robinson, an interesting showdown between former friends Juice and Finlay, a possible hoss battle between Shingo and a much tougher Yoshihashi this year, and of course, another modern classic between Ospreay and Shingo Takagi. So that's it. That's my synopsis of this year's G1 Climax 32 and what I expect to see. It's going to be a different format this year. Should be interesting to mix it up a little bit. And again, I do think it's better for the guys that they're only going to be wrestling 6 matches spread out over 4 weeks and not wrestling as much and as hard as they have been in the past with this tournament. Again, this year with all of the injuries. I am looking forward to seeing what's going down on this tournament. If you want to keep track with it, you can hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know when my G1 videos go up. Again, I'll be reviewing it every 2 or 3 days, updating standings and letting you guys know who's in the lead for each block and who needs what points and who they are facing next. It is, I say, of all the things I do on this channel for pro wrestling, the G1 Climax weeks are some of the funnest weeks I have covering wrestling. Because again, it really feels like I'm covering an actual sport when I'm covering the G1 Climax in New Japan Pro Wrestling. So hopefully you join me on this journey for the next 4 weeks. And again, if you aren't subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe. I will see you guys here pretty soon as we will kick it off with my review of the first 2 nights of the G1 Climax. And then we'll be reviewing it for the rest of the next 4 weeks right here on the Rantin Review Pro Wrestling. Have a good day.